All right, so this is an extension of the chapter How I Met My Mother. If you did hear the voice snippet on me being silenced at the doctor's office and me not knowing or being raised with my mother and her not being here in Toronto for 24, 25 years. I've mentioned before that, my dad did make the decision to break up with her, and, the family was severed because of that. But there's a longer-winded story to the whole situation. My mother did not want to have me, so when my dad and mom were together, my dad wanted a child, but my mother did not want to be a mother. So, just based off of that, when my dad broke up with her, he said that he would be keeping me and raising me alone. So he never had an intention to remarry because he had been through a lot with my mom. And knowing this information, I don't care about the fact that she never wanted to have me. That doesn't even bother me. I don't care about that. What I do look at, though, is for my dad to make the decision to have me stay with him and drop her means that he had to make a really strong decision, which meant it would have altered his life, because I don't think any father or mother is willing to go at it alone unless the circumstances isn't the way that they want it to be. So in those years of not knowing her, every now and then when my dad would slip out of character, I want to call it, he would mention tidbits in frustration as to how my mother was as a person. And because my dad's extra and very angry, he was a very angry person, I sometimes thought he was exaggerating. But in these many years of being raised by my stepmother and then finally venturing out to Japan, I kept a distance between myself and my dad because the drama between him and my stepmom was a lot. And I just said, okay, I gotta keep myself separate so I can move forward with my own life. Now, when you're dealing with manipulators or controllers, people who are controlling in nature, they often are always thinking of ways to regain control of whoever they want to be in control of. So they're always strategizing on what they can do, what part of the checker game they can play in order to reel you back in. And I'm no stranger to that process because I met people and friends who behave this way. So being treated this way by my dad was like a cycle I understood and I tried to avoid at all costs. So he was strategizing, I believe, and the strategy he created while I was in Japan and while I kept my distance for over a decade meant that he needed to find a way to bring me back into the mix and to also make the family that he originally created look complete, but it doesn't work that way. So eventually, my mother came back to Toronto after 25 years. And I kept getting these calls from my stepmom because I'd keep in touch with her while I was in Osaka. And, we'd talk about regular stuff. How are you doing? How is it going there? Okay, fine, great. Weather, how are you managing? Okay, good. And one random day, when she called, she said that her lawyer's office was contacted by my biological mom, and that she's asking to communicate with me. And I was like, wow, like, where is she calling from if she's contacting your lawyer to connect? And my stepmom's like, I think she's back in Toronto. And I was like, oh, okay. So out of courtesy, I allowed my stepmom to hand over my cell number, and my mom called, and she just kept calling, and her emotional state was frantic, and I couldn't understand why it was frantic, because by then I was like, 25, 26 years old. Like, I'm not really panicked to see her, like, there's no niggling feeling like I need to meet her. I was kind of like, okay. So she kept insisting that she wanted to come to Japan, and I was like, well, no, I don't want you to come here. And the way that energy works, like, when you're a perceptive individual, you can feel the heaviness or the frantic energy of a person when they're not balanced. And I just kept feeling like the energy she was bringing towards me hers was not well or balanced, and she was also bringing my father's energy. So I can feel that, like, controlling, domineering, and then frantic, convoluted energy. It was just insane. Like, I eventually stopped answering their calls. And while their phone calls were coming, I had multiple cousins also calling, asking me why I'm in China. It was one of the weirdest dynamics happening. But for abuse survivors, you'll notice that when one abuser or flying monkey comes, all of them come and they gang up on you to kind of shake or rock your energy because they want to destabilize you from your place of power. So that was what was happening. But because I was far away, it was easier for me to maintain my boundaries. And so she kept saying she wanted to see me. And I was 50-50. 50% I was like, I'm not in a rush. And then the other 50% was like, she seems more insane than my dad. So I was just kind of like, I don't know about that. And so I kept my distance. And then I was coming home one Christmas, and I talk about co-parenting in my book because I felt like I was the grown child in a co-parenting situation with three parents that hate each other and don't get along. So when I came home that Christmas, in my mind, I was like, well, I'm going to go to the home that I'm used to, which was with my stepmom. But I was gaining so much antagonism and hate energy from my mom and my dad because in their mind, it's like, well, you're our child, so you shouldn't be there. And I was still like, well, it doesn't matter what you think, it matters what I think, right? And so I agreed to meet her at Sherway Gardens in Etobicoke, and my dad kept insisting he wanted to be there. And I'm like, no, because I've spent many years with you in the same house, and you just kept mistreating me while I was living with you. Let me see the person that I never met before. That way I'd be able to see for myself who she is without your influence. And so you'll read in the book how that meeting went with her. I'm not going to get into it here on this voice snippet, but in that meeting, I decided that I didn't trust her. I decided that she wasn't honest. And I also decided that she was back in Toronto for an alternative reason. It had nothing to do with meeting me. It had nothing to do with reconciling with her. It had nothing to do with nothing to do with me. And I want to add in, it had nothing to do with clearing up the air with my dad. It had nothing to do with nothing. I feel that she was a very self-interested person. When she arrived to Toronto, there was a lot of chaos. I think that she came for an alternative reason, and you'll find out some of the reasons when you read the book, but I think my hunch was right. I looked at her and I just felt like I can see why my dad didn't want to continue a marriage with her, because between her and my dad, they never filled in the blanks where there was a lot of missing information. So I felt them together were very insincere. I also felt that they saw me as less knowledgeable and less intelligent and less perceptive than I actually was. So in many ways, I used it to my advantage. And then in other ways, I was disappointed that they weren't elevated enough to see me for who I really was. But some people might write that off as a cultural thing, or some people might write it off as I'll always be their child. But I saw it more as they don't regard, or they don't think that higher knowledge exists in a child, no matter what the age of that child is. And so I just tucked away my personal knowledge and observations, and I braced myself while I was in Japan after that meeting, because I didn't want to see them both, or my real mom. I didn't want to see her again when I came back. So I waited, I think, 2 years after returning from Toronto before I reached out to them, because I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Like I mentioned in my voice snippet on Home, the one that has the picture of Love Child Social House, when I walked back into my mother's life and her and my dad, connecting with them again, the chaos that ensued for the next 5 to 7 years dealing with them was wild. And I've come to realize that her chaos is a signature feeling and a signature vibe. So whenever I feel her chaos, I know she's been near my area, or she's been somewhere where I work, or she's been somewhere where I stay, because it's undeniable. It's wild. Anyway, read the book. You'll know more about how I met my mother. Thank you.